heard me in a while. I'm TheWolvesDen, the host of Menu Combat, and this is the first of what I mentioned in the season finale, a side questing episode. Here, this is an episode that doesn't follow the natural format and is more of spur of the moment as we take a break until season 2 arrives. Now, I'm actually very excited about today's episode, particularly because I think it's a good question that I think gets to the idea of who JRPG fans are sociologically. And it's a funny... Okay, so I don't know if everyone's familiar with Robert Boyd. Robert Boyd is one of, I think it's both of them are Boyd brothers of the Boyd Games, who create, I think, Call of Cthulhu, Cosmic Star Heroine, and most recently, This Way Lies Madness. Now, I've only had experience specifically with Cosmic Star Heroine, and I would definitely approve of that game in terms of telling you that it's excellent, it's extremely well thoughtful approach to combat, and in particular when I think about how they design and think about games being very combat first, and not just only first, but it is very much of what attracts me to their approach. I think they're excellent. And what's interesting about Robert is that Robert is a person from, if I remember correctly, because he also posts an era time to time, talks a lot about influence of Phantasy Star. In fact, if you look at the UI for the combat of This Way Lies Madness, it is definitely Phantasy Star for evocative. Again, I haven't played these, but I'm talking about from like watch throughs and playthroughs I've seen. I can see the correlation and comparison. And I think they've also mentioned Grandia. And so there are a lot of RPGs that they take influence from, but I don't have a history with. And I think it's so fascinating that I've gotten enamored with Cosmic Star Heroine and seeing just a different branch of the RPG family tree. And they asked a really cool question. And so this was like the beginning of September. So here's what Robert Boyd said on Twitter. Their Twitter name is WereZombie, W-E-R-E, not zombie, Zompire, Z-O-M-P-I-R-E. Again, I think there's just a lot here that I think we can unpack. Here's what he says. I think it's crazy that when someone wants to get into JRPGs, people primarily recommend a bunch of ancient games, many of which aren't easy to acquire these days. That's great for hardcore fans, but brand new players would be better served by newer fare. And he's not wrong. I think about when I talk to folks who don't play JRPGs. In fact, if you even think about what I said on the episode with Shiv when he was talking about his experience primarily Western RPGs, what did I recommend him? Chrono Trigger. When I think about introducing folks to the thing I love, it is very much, not just only, but it is very easy for me to go into the bag of Chrono Trigger, go into the bag of an old Final Fantasy and pick a bunch of old games. Now, he says that it's more so about ancient games, many of which are easy to acquire. But I don't think it's just that. I think it is the idea that he mentions that it's hardcore fans and be served by newer fare. And I think part of the implicit thing here is about quality of life / player sensibilities. And I think that's what makes this a great question, is that why is it that we as a JRPG community can center or put a default to old games when we talk to people who are new? Why is that our immediate answer? Now, I will say, qualitatively, if we think about it, we don't really have a statistical answer for this question, right? We don't have a research empirical way to think about it. But I say that to say that I'm sure many folks who got into RPGs, JRPGs, they probably got through a modern persona at the time of their release or something of that nature. So I don't want to think that people aren't being recommended newer games. I don't think that's entirely true, but I think there's a deep morsel of truth that I think we can unpack here. I think there are 4 reasons for why we do this as a fan base. I think we do this because we understand that modern games aren't short. I think there's a part of revisionist history, and not in a negative sense, a understanding or willing to engage with a lack of budget and legacy franchises. I think if you want to answer, again, what Robert is asking, why do we primarily recommend a bunch of ancient games to get into JRPGs rather than newer fare? It's because they're short. It's because of our desire as a community to kind of rewrite history, our sensibilities are understanding to engage with a lack of budget, and our engagement with legacy franchises. So let's unpack each of these things to understand what I'm getting at. One, all RPGs are short. I think this is actually one of the most things that I think we as community can all agree, is that whenever a new RPG gets announced, the first thing we all say is like, how am I going to fit in the time for this? That is our instinctual response. So if it be the Trails games where you're asked to be to play 40-hour RPGs at best if you want to do the full gargantuan experience, or Xenoblade is about 80 hours, or even Persona's 100 hours, like for a lot of games. Dragon Quest, if you even want to properly include Act 3, is at least 80 hours. If you are thinking about recommending a newer game, one of the core challenges you face is that they're long. And so when you think about trying to recommend something to a person who's never played a JRPG, or that's a hard sell, right? Like I think about one of my friends where I'm like, I warned them because they were like, they watched me play Xenoblade 3 and they were interested. And I was like, you do know this is an 80-hour game. Like, I'm trying to push them away because I want them to try it, right? I do think they can get into it without having played a previous Xeno, at least based on where I'm at. But I also was like, you play 20-hour games. That's kind of like your threshold. And so I wonder, part of the answers of why do we recommend old games, ancient games, has to do with the fact that a lot of old games are shorter, right? Earthbound is what, 24 hours, Chrono Trigger 20 hours, Final Fantasy 5 is like 30 hours, Secret of Mana is another 20-ish hours. Like, most of those are just a little bit above, or not by much, around that 20 to 30 hour range, where that's still an investment, and I think you get to experience the connection with RPGs as these long adventures, but it isn't going into like, oh gosh, why did I invest in this? Or where if folks get into something, they may still not finish it for months. I think it is the idea that the minute you clip into that PS1, PS2, anything modern, you're getting a longer game. And I think part of our answer why we recommend games that might even be out, or even be like, it's that we understand that time is a resource. And I think that speaks to that, what I would guess, and I might be wrong, correct me, if it's not an indie RPG, so I'm talking about what they've done, the Boyd Games crew with Cosmic Star Heroine, or This Way It Lies Madness, but I'm even thinking what I'm hearing Sea of Stars is around 25 hours, Chained Echoes is about 30 hours, Child of Light is 5 hours. Like, if it's not going to be an indie, you're very hard pressed to get a bigger budget JRPG styled game under 30 hours. I'm thinking, I think FF7 Remake is about 30, if I have that correctly, and then I know Nier is about 20. That's really the field. The minute you either go through the indie gauntlet, which you can actually build a lot of taste and like perspective for the genre through that. So like, that's always actually not a bad recommendation. But if you were to give people like a person who wants to go buy a physical game or things of that nature, I'm guessing it's only the two Nier games and FF7 Remake that are about 30 hours or less as a JRPG experience. I mean, Trials of Mana, can't forget that. But you kind of see my point. There's not a plethora of those choices when people think of what's the best JRPG release over the last few years. And I think the default reason about why do we pick old games is because they're short. The other one is actually more tricky. And I think, as I said, part of the reason why I was interested about this question is that I think it suggests, not that it suggests, but I think answering this made me realize that we, as a community of fans who love the genre, are more willing to engage with old games, and not in a negative sense, but in the sense of that we will build the legacy because that's what we've kind of done as a genre. One of the things that I think about for my age group, I'm not sure how other folks who are younger than me. So I'm like 30. I'm totally out of it. I'm 33. And as a result of that, one of the questions to think about is, hey, the way that I've learned about the legacy of these games is through cats who played translations of these games, right? People mention, Legend of Bahamut or Tales of Drudras, or even Romancing Saga was recommended in our communities before they got official releases, or even before they have, right? Like the Romancing Sagas, the entire Saga series is now available on modern platforms. But I'm saying, like, why do you get Bahamut Legend or any of this? Is that ultimately, to be an RPG fan is to go back into time and engage with the certain golden periods, particularly because it is unlikely, not that it's not, and I know many folks who do YouTube who are my age, older, who got to engage with the golden era as it was happening. That is not most people's stories. Think about it. The joke that we make about Earthbound is that it didn't sell. It's a game that has a legacy bigger than anybody who's actually played it. And that's not just them. The entire SNES era of RPGs have a legacy that's about retrospective. Like, how many people actually played Chrono Trigger on release? I don't think we really have an answer to that question. How many people played FF6 upon release? There's a reason why FF7 gets touted as the kind of torchbearer moment, because it is the moment that a lot more eyes were placed on the genre. And so when I say what I'm saying, I think that inherently we've built a curative eye to go back to the old games to kind of like, what was Square publishing at that time? What was Enix publishing at that time? We go back and rummage through history for a genre that was not as popular, especially if you were like us or myself in the West. And so what we've done is that we've built the legacy of these games. How many people, I think the difference between people who've grown back to FF6 versus played FF6 on release are drastically different. And I think you can do that for most of the classic RPG franchises at that time. And I think that what that does is that means that anybody who enters a space and does a quick Google search, like, what RPGs do I need to play? They're going to go through folks who have done the curative process. And the reason why I call it curative process, or this going back through history and rewriting the importance of these games, is because upon release, not all of them were important. I think about when people do the Genesis Super Nintendo comparison right now. One of the things that don't get mentioned, but it's for a big segment, especially in the Western audience, about why the Genesis, what was like a 52 to 48%, is because of the legacy of sports games. What was published on a Sega Genesis from a sports angle was a little bit more compelling than what was happening on the Super Nintendo. That's a fact that in the gaming communities that we run in, do not get brought up all the time because our relationship with sports games are different. But that if you lived in that time, that is what people would have thrown out to you, a part of the legacy of these systems. It's not to say that no one would have mentioned Phantasy Star series and 4, but I get the understanding. Again, I'm a person who's coming back to this retroactively myself, but I think about folks who grew up at the time, what they tell me, it's that people were saying the Genesis was better than the Super Nintendo because of Phantasy Star, or saying that the SNES was better than or saying the SNES was better than the Genesis because of Chrono Trigger. A lot more had to do with the release of a Madden or a release of whatever sports games were popular at that time. And so what I say that to say is that we as RPG fans are coming back to that golden era with a sense of eyes to be like, what was the history? What really happened? To like fill in the historical gap from a Western audience to what FF7 kind of throws into like the mainstream. I think we do that a lot. And I love it. Please do not listen to this and be like, oh, so are we doing? No, it's what we do. It's the reason why Live Alive can come back around and we're hyped, because the legacy has been built by the community about this is important. Now, whether or not people have got to play it is different or people went back, but the talk about it has existed. And so when these things can trot back forward, now with a bigger audience willing to play these style of games, it's very different. And I think what it means is that I think we as an RPG audience are always going to introduce folks to that same curative lens that we just innately have done to engage with the art form. So that's one. So we've talked about them being short. We talked about revising history. Another one I think is that we're used to a lack of budget. And so what that means is that you're talking about a bunch of ancient games, but it's not just that. I think implicitly it's an emphasis on games that are just old. That means quality of life is old, or the graphical things, the things that might appeal newer players. We don't always think through that lens and framework, because to be a fan of the genre that we love isn't always about us getting access to budget. I think about, and again, this is the ways I've lensed it, but you don't have to agree. But I think about, like, I don't think Trails looks particularly beautiful. I'm talking about the FC first chapter, the Sky trilogy, or even talking about the other releases of, like, dang, my brain just totally threw off. Other releases such as the Cold Steel, I don't think they look great. And I think the first chapter trilogy I don't think has a good style for being retro-ish, right? Like, it's a PSP game originally, and the limitations of the art style, it's like, I just don't think the art style works. But when you get to Cold Steel and stuff like that, that's aesthetically a generation behind, and that's not a diss on Falcom, right? Like, at the end of the day, most folks think highly of East 8, even though East 8 doesn't look a certain way. It has a aesthetic, an approach that feels generations before, and I don't think it looks great, but it's something I'm interested in, because we are used to the idea that sometimes the best things released in a generation don't look aesthetically pleasing, and I think that tracks at least in the HD era forward. I'm talking about back in the Xbox 360, Wii, PS3 generation. The legacy of something like Xenoblade is very much a game that I think has a beautiful art style, but visual fidelity, not the best. But it didn't stop people from saying, well, this is as good as, for example, FF13 or Resonance of Fate, or even the Ni no Kuni stuff that might have more aesthetic HD visuals, or even more so thinking about the fact that folks would be playing handheld games. And I even bring in that piece. This is a sub piece to lack of budget, is that we'll play a lot of handheld games which sometimes engage with, like, older generations of games, right? Think about how many people play Dragon Quest through their DS and 3DS, or got into Final Fantasy through the re-releases on the GBA, or any of those natures. So even thinking about, even if you're a newer fan engaging with these franchises, you're engaging with them, old games, older mechanics, older dispositions. And that's okay. And I think our sensitivity to that is a little bit all over the place. And what do I mean by that? It's like, I also think we just take on these mechanics from a lack of budget, or a lack of polish, or be more idiosyncratic. That's kind of part of the nature of the game, right? I'm thinking right now, the best example, a recommendation that I think somebody might throw out is like, hey, play Earthbound. Earthbound has the worst inventory management system I've ever used in a video game. But they're trying to charm the hell out of you to work through the mess that is that system. That means you have the calling system to wait for someone to come, drop off something, or to pick up something. That's not a menu. They're trying to charm, because they know that you can't carry everything, and they need to store it in other parts of the memory. It's a cool idea, but that is frustrating. And I'm thinking about how things don't necessarily overlap in terms of the number amounts, or the packets, or trying to figure out, like, what does a condiment do to like, it is a fussy inventory system, but it's RPG, boy. Like, it's what we do. And I think about, there's a level that we have as a threshold for the ways that we're willing to engage and deal with this component, that I think we're just a little less sensitive than other folks. That doesn't mean that we don't have those moments. I think I don't remember the full conversation about the re-release of Shin Megami Tensei HD Nocturne. But part of the thing that I know that people were like, why is, I think it had to be patched in, or I think we got it later, where it was, hey, you can now combine, I think it was a day one free DLC, where you can now combine the monsters and know what you're getting rather than being random. Like, we want some quality of life, but only so much of that quality of life do we want. And so I think that's just a sensitivity that we have. And so in Earthbound, I don't really hear it as much as an issue, but I do hear it as an issue in SMT on its first release before the re-release on the systems. And so I think that's a big element of all of this. The other part is, and I think this is kind of something I wonder how true it is, but I'm going to throw it out there. You guys tell me if you believe this one. As you can tell, I'm convinced of the other three. I'm not sure about this. I think when engaging with a legacy franchise, the default is to recommend you an older game for two reasons. One, folks in the RPG space tend to be folks who want to recommend people like, hey, if you think you're going to play more than one of these games, it might behoove you to play it in chronological order so you can see how things happened. That is such a JRPG response to what is happening. And so every time I see somebody recommend something, they'll be like, hey, you should play this. However, do you think you play more than like 2 or 3? Because if you play more than 2 and 3, it might behoove you to just play the logical order. You see how we saw it as it happened. Like, it is that natural response. And I think there's almost a thing of, hey, if you're coming over to the dark side, come over fully. Come engage with the fullness. And so that's why I think if you're engaging with a legacy franchise, people want you to kind of see how things change. Again, I don't think this is a regular answer. I do think we more so give this answer to folks who are fellow RPG fans, where we know that we can just like throw it out there. But I do think for any legacy franchise, it is not very rare, but typically, if you're recommending somebody from a legacy franchise, I'm talking about legacy as in it's a franchise that's been out longer than 10 years. It is not, I won't say it's unlikely, but it's not typical that the newest release in that legacy franchise is a guaranteed recommendation for the entire people. And what do I mean by that? I think the last time a modern release was unanimous to be like, yeah, this is what you should recommend people, was probably Fire Emblem Three Houses. I remember saying to myself, with Fire Emblem Three Houses, is that it feels like it quelled the fan base wars for a while. Things have come back up with Engage, but during that time period, I felt like most folks, in addition to considering accessibility and all of that, is that there was enough here to quell all the fan bases so that most folks would say, whether or not Fire Emblem Three Houses was the best game, but they felt comfortable recommending it because it can satiate a lot of palates. I think for every other legacy franchise, maybe Persona's the other one where they're probably not in this space, but I'm thinking it's like, what is the Final Fantasy to recommend? That's just a dicey answer. Like, you don't have a real simple clarity, right? Like, people like 16, but I don't know if people feel like 16 is a Final Fantasy game, per se. That's a whole larger thing, but you kind of get what I'm saying, where this idea of recommending in a long-standing franchise just gets a lot more messy. And so I think sometimes it's easier to go back in a franchise's history and think of the last time where most of the fan base was met and recognizing that might have been your introduction to the series. So I'm thinking that, I don't know if you'll get it still, but I would still say it. I think I would recommend on Final Fantasy X all day, every day. I think it's simple. I think it's straightforward. I think that. But you might even think, I'm thinking about Robert's response, where it's like, that's an old game. That's 23 years ago. But I would think that's kind of the conundrum you fall in, is that once you start thinking about older games, you think about certain games that might be able to fit some things better, and it's not always a new game that's able to appease a fan base and like be a good recommendation, because people want to recommend stuff that kind of feel like the rest of the franchise, right? And so I'm thinking right now, my answer with Final Fantasy is like, I don't know where I'd do. I'd say 10, but I think people would say 7 remake right now. I think that's the trajectory that I think we'll end up at. But I don't know if people would have said 7 remake upon the release. I don't know. And I'm thinking, so I say Final Fantasy. With Pokemon, I don't know what people will tell you. Like, people might tell you black and white, but they might not tell you black and white. I think they'll just tell you don't play Pokemon. I could be dead wrong depending on the community. Look, I love Sun and Moon. I love Legends Arceus. So I'm joshing a little bit. I'm poking the bear, but I do say this, like, I don't think there's a Pokemon release now that the entire community be like, yeah, this is a good full representation of what we like. It's not perfect, but it's not a perfect representation. Like, I think Legends Arceus is almost there, but I think Sword and Shield has really hit the perfect recommendation space, nor do I get the impression that Scarlet and Violet have cleaned up its act to really be there. Dragon Quest is actually probably one of the few ones, along with Persona, where it's probably going to be automatically the new one. People are going to tell you, yeah, go play 11 or go play Persona 5. I think with every other long-standing franchise, the Xenoblade stuff is interesting. I think we'll say play Xenoblade 1, but you'll get folks who say, oh, go play 2 or whatever. There's a completionist aspect to that. That's about 10 years now. And I'm thinking, what would Disgaea folks say? What would folks for... I mean... we can do this. I think now when I talk about these franchises, part of it is just the experience of Order 2. Why do we recommend old games? Is that sometimes it's just easier to do it in order. I don't have a full answer, but these are the 4 things I was wrestling with, where it's like we recommend or engage with older games to folks because they're shorter. It's because of our history of revising history. Our sensibilities are different because we're okay with lack of budget or lack of quality of life. And if you want to engage with a legacy franchise, it is very unusual for the newest game at the time of release to be the de facto recommendation. I think all of these answer the questions. If there are other answers and explanations that you have in mind about why we do this, let me know. And tell me, what's the last RPG you've recommended someone? Right now, I think I am, if you ask me, I have a friend of mine who am I trying to recommend games. So I actually recommend This Way is Lies Madness. I've mentioned Xenoblade, and I've mentioned Fire Emblem. I think Fire Emblem Awakening is what I recommended to them, right? Again, not modern. Anyways, on that note, I hope you appreciated the side quest episode. This was a nice thought experiment to like go throughout my brain and piece together. And if you, again, have different answers, let me know. Again, your host, TheWolvesDen. Find me at TheWolvesDen25 on Twitter, on Instagram, on Threads, on Blue Sky. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. Listen to us here at Menu Combat. And don't forget to follow Menu Combat on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also on TikTok at TheWolvesDen25. And again, this is a Menu Combat episode, so don't forget to customize your party. Peace.